Celine was still standing in the hallway in the black dress she had worn to bury her mother when the front door opened again. She looked up, expecting another grieving relative who had forgotten something. Instead, her father walked in holding another woman's hand. Behind them came two teenagers dragging rolling suitcases across the hardwood floor. Richard didn't hesitate. "This is Evelyn," he said flatly. "My wife." The word hit harder than the funeral had. Celine stared at him. "You're what?" "My wife," he repeated. "We got married this afternoon." Before she could even process what she'd heard, Evelyn smiled politely, as if she were arriving for a holiday visit instead of invading a grieving family's home. One of the teenagers picked up the framed wedding portrait of Celine's parents from the entry table. "Where should this go?" he asked. Richard answered without looking at Celine. "Storage." Then he pointed toward the living room. "And move that old chair too. We're redecorating." The chair had been Margaret's favorite place to read during chemotherapy. Celine stepped forward instinctively. "Don't touch that." Richard finally looked directly at his daughter. "It's not your decision anymore." He wrapped an arm around Evelyn's shoulders. "This is their house now." Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. "You need to pack your things before tonight." For a moment, the house became strangely quiet. Only hours earlier, it had been filled with mourners carrying flowers, whispering condolences, and remembering Margaret's kindness. Now strangers were deciding what belonged in each room. Evelyn walked through the living room with surprising confidence. "I think these curtains should be replaced," she said, "and we'll repaint before school starts." Her daughter had already begun removing family photographs from the shelves. Each frame that disappeared felt like another piece of Margaret being erased. Celine looked toward her father, waiting for some sign this was grief speaking. Instead, he folded his arms. "I've spent years taking care of this family," he said. "Now I'm finally thinking about my future." "My mother was buried 4 hours ago," Celine whispered. "And life moves on." His voice contained no hesitation. No regret. No apology. She suddenly remembered every night she had slept beside her mother's hospital bed. Every appointment she had rearranged. Every promotion she had declined, so someone would always be home. While she had been caring for Margaret, Richard had apparently been building another life. Evelyn's son carried another box toward the hallway. "Should I use this bedroom?" he asked. Richard nodded toward Celine's room. "That's yours." Celine slowly walked upstairs. She packed only one overnight bag. Not because she accepted what had happened. Because arguing with a man who had already replaced his wife before the funeral was over wouldn't change anything. Before leaving, she stopped in her mother's bedroom one last time. Everything still smelled faintly of lavender. On the nightstand sat Margaret's address book. Inside was a folded business card with one handwritten sentence. "If anything happens, call him. He'll know what to do." Beneath the note was the name of her mother's attorney. Celine quietly stepped outside and made a single phone call. "I think my mother wanted you to hear from me today." The attorney listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said only one sentence. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." She didn't ask why. She thanked him and hung up. As she walked away from the house, Richard watched from the doorway. "You finally realized you're fighting a battle you can't win," he called after her. Celine never turned around. She simply got into her friend's car and left. The next morning, just after 8 o'clock, the doorbell echoed through the house. Richard opened the door with complete confidence. A man in a gray suit stood on the porch carrying a leather briefcase. "My name is Daniel Foster," he said calmly. Richard frowned. "What do you want?" The man met his eyes without blinking. "I'm here regarding Margaret's instructions." Richard's face instantly lost its color. Richard gripped the edge of the front door. "I think you've made a mistake," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The man in the gray suit remained composed. "I'm Daniel Foster, attorney for Margaret Collins. I was instructed to make contact the morning after her funeral." Richard stepped into the doorway, blocking the entrance. "My wife is gone. Whatever paperwork there is can wait." "I'm afraid it cannot." Richard glanced over his shoulder. Evelyn was standing in the hallway, listening. "I said not today." Without raising his voice, Mr. Foster nodded once. "Very well. I'll return when all interested parties are present." He handed Richard a sealed envelope. "Please don't ignore the appointment time inside." Before Richard could ask another question, the attorney turned, walked back to his car, and drove away. Richard stared at the envelope for several seconds before crumpling it in his fist. Across town, Celine sat quietly at her longtime friend Nora's kitchen table, wrapping both hands around a mug of untouched tea. "You don't have to pretend you're okay," Nora said softly. "I'm not pretending." Celine looked out the window. "I just don't know what happened to my family." For the first time since leaving the house, she allowed herself to think about the final weeks of her mother's life. Little moments returned with startling clarity. Margaret sitting at the dining room table long after midnight, carefully sorting folders into neat stacks. Margaret asking strange questions. "Celine, if someone could protect a family after they're gone, do you think they should?" At the time, Celine had smiled. "Mom, you're worrying too much." Her mother had only nodded. "I hope you're right." Another memory surfaced. One afternoon after chemotherapy, Margaret had been searching through a desk drawer. She had looked toward the hallway before lowering her voice. "Some people reveal themselves only after I'm gone." Celine had laughed nervously. "Please don't talk like that." "I'm serious." Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. "When that day comes, don't let guilt make your decisions." Before Celine could ask what she meant, Richard had entered the room carrying groceries. Margaret immediately closed the folder in front of her. The conversation ended. At the time, Celine assumed her mother simply didn't want to discuss death in front of her husband. Now the memory felt completely different. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She answered. "Celine." "Yes." "This is Daniel Foster." His voice was calm and professional. "I've arranged a formal meeting for tomorrow morning. I need you there." "What is this about?" "I'd rather discuss it with everyone present." He paused. "And bring any identification you have." Margaret expected this meeting would eventually happen. Before Celine could ask another question, the call ended. She stared at the phone. Margaret expected this. Expected what? By afternoon, Richard began calling. Again. And again. Finally, Celine answered. "When are you coming for the rest of your things?" he demanded. "I haven't decided." "You don't have that luxury anymore." She remained silent. Richard continued. "Evelyn's children need the rooms. My mother's room isn't even cold yet. Life doesn't stop because you're emotional." He disconnected. That evening, one of Celine's cousins sent her several screenshots from social media. Evelyn had already begun posting photographs inside the house. Fresh Beginnings read. One picture showed Margaret's favorite china cabinet completely emptied. Another showed the living room. The floral curtains Margaret had sewn herself were gone. The family portraits had disappeared from the fireplace mantel. In their place stood framed photographs of Evelyn and her children. Celine zoomed in on the image. Even her mother's wedding portrait had vanished. She lowered the phone slowly. This wasn't simply a grieving widower moving on. Someone had been preparing to erase Margaret from that house almost immediately. And if her mother had anticipated it, then the attorney's visit was only the beginning. The following afternoon, the Collins family gathered at Richard's request. The atmosphere inside the house felt nothing like the funeral the day before. Small groups of relatives stood in tense silence, exchanging uneasy glances as they noticed how much had already changed. Margaret's favorite paintings were missing. New decorative boxes sat on the coffee table. Even the family photographs had been replaced. An elderly cousin whispered, "How did all of this happen overnight?" No one answered. Richard stepped into the center of the room with Evelyn beside him. "I appreciate everyone coming," he announced. "After losing Margaret, I've had to make some difficult decisions." He looked directly at Celine. "Unfortunately, my daughter chose to leave me alone during the hardest moment of my life." Several relatives turned toward Celine. Richard continued before she could respond. "She packed her things and walked out without even asking how I was doing." Evelyn gently placed a hand on his arm. "We're only trying to bring peace back into this home," she said with a sympathetic smile. "Richard deserves happiness after everything he's been through." A few relatives nodded. From the outside, it sounded believable. Celine stood quietly near the fireplace. She could have explained everything. She could have repeated every cruel word Richard had spoken. Instead, she remained silent. Not because she was weak, because someone else was about to speak. The front door opened. Daniel Foster entered carrying a leather briefcase and several sealed folders. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "I'm here on behalf of Margaret Collins." The room immediately fell silent. Richard's shoulders stiffened. "I told you this wasn't necessary." Mr. Foster ignored the remark. "I'll only need everyone's attention later this afternoon." He looked around the room. These matters concern everyone with an interest in Margaret's estate. The conversation shifted instantly. Instead of questioning Celine, relatives began looking at Richard. He forced a smile that looked increasingly strained. "What matters?" his younger brother asked. "They'll be explained in due course," Mr. Foster replied calmly. "I ask only that no one remove additional property from the residence until then." Richard's expression darkened. "That's ridiculous. We'll discuss it shortly." As guests gathered in the dining room, Margaret's older sister, Aunt Helen, slowly approached Celine. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Celine looked at her. "Do you remember the charity fundraiser last spring?" Celine nodded. "I thought I saw Richard there." Helen lowered her voice. "He wasn't alone." She glanced toward Evelyn. "He was holding her hand." Celine's breath caught. "Are you sure?" "I didn't say anything because I convinced myself I must have misunderstood." Helen sighed. "But seeing them together today." She didn't finish the sentence. The silence said enough. Nearby, two cousins had overheard. Within moments, whispers began spreading through the room. "I heard they knew each other for years." Did Margaret know? How long had this been going on? Richard noticed the growing conversation. "What exactly are you people whispering about?" No one answered immediately. Helen simply looked at him. Richard's face tightened. "Don't start inventing stories." Before anyone could respond, Evelyn's teenage son walked in carrying a small storage receipt. "Mom," he said casually, "where do you want the rest of the boxes from the storage unit? The one we filled before the funeral?" The room froze. Evelyn's eyes widened. "Jason." "What?" "You said we'd finish unpacking this weekend." Richard stepped forward immediately. "That's enough." Jason looked confused. "I was only asking." "I said enough." His sharp tone silenced the boy. But the damage had already been done. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. Storage unit. Before the funeral. The timeline no longer made sense. Celine slowly pieced everything together. This hadn't been an impulsive marriage after grief. Someone had prepared this move weeks, perhaps months, in advance. The affair itself was only one part of a much larger plan. Mr. Foster closed his briefcase and stood. "I believe it's time." He removed a sealed legal folder. In accordance with Margaret Collins' written instructions, I must formally notify everyone present. He looked directly at Richard. That no person may sell, renovate, transfer, occupy additional portions of, or remove significant property from this residence until the legal directives have been executed. Richard slammed his hand onto the dining table. This house belongs to me. Daniel Foster calmly opened the folder. Without raising his voice, he answered, "Not according to these documents." The dining room erupted. "What documents?" Richard demanded, taking a step toward Daniel Foster. "I've lived in this house for 35 years. My wife is gone, and everything she owned passes to me." Mr. Foster didn't flinch. "Please take your seat, Mr. Collins." "I'm not sitting down. You'll want to hear this." The attorney placed several folders on the table, each carefully labeled. Every relative watched in complete silence. Celine remained beside the window, her heart pounding. She had no idea what was inside those files. Only that her mother had somehow prepared for this moment. Mr. Foster opened the first folder. These are certified financial records provided by Margaret Collins over the past 11 months. Richard's expression hardened. "I don't know what game you're playing." "This isn't a game." The attorney slid copies of bank statements across the table. Mrs. Collins asked that these be reviewed only if certain events occurred immediately following her death. Richard's brother picked up the first page. His eyes widened. "Richard, what's this?" It showed repeated withdrawals from a joint account. Large amounts, always transferred into another account. Month after month. Mr. Foster continued. Mrs. Collins noticed these transactions while receiving medical treatment. Richard folded his arms. "I managed our finances." "You did?" The attorney nodded. "Without fully informing your wife." Another document followed. Credit card statements, hotel reservations, furniture purchases, household appliances, all delivered to a rented storage facility. Every receipt was dated while Margaret was still alive. A murmur swept through the room. Celine stared at the papers. "You were buying furniture." She looked at her father. "While Mom was fighting cancer." Richard refused to answer. Mr. Foster reached for another folder. "Mrs. Collins also instructed me to disclose this timeline." He laid out a series of dated documents. The rental agreement for the storage unit, moving company estimates, school enrollment inquiries for Evelyn's children. Everything had been arranged months before Margaret's funeral. No one spoke. The evidence spoke for itself. Aunt Helen slowly shook her head. "You already knew they were moving in." Richard's silence confirmed it. Evelyn turned toward him. "You told me we couldn't move sooner because you wanted to avoid gossip." Richard didn't respond. "You said the house would automatically become yours." Still nothing. Her voice became sharper. "Did you lie to me too?" Mr. Foster removed another envelope. "This concerns ownership." Richard immediately stepped forward. "I don't care what it says." "You should." The attorney unfolded the document. Margaret Collins transferred her ownership interest into an irrevocable family trust before her death. Richard laughed bitterly. "That's impossible. It has already been recorded." He handed certified copies to several relatives. The trust became fully effective upon Mrs. Collins' passing. Richard grabbed one of the papers. His hands trembled as he scanned the pages. "No." Mr. Foster continued calmly. "Under the trust terms, Mr. Collins retained limited temporary occupancy rights only if he acted in accordance with the trustee's conditions." Richard looked up. "What conditions?" "The first condition prohibited any attempt to remove the primary beneficiary from the residence." The room fell silent again. Celine felt her breath catch. Primary beneficiary. Mr. Foster looked toward her. You. Richard's face drained of color. The moment you ordered Miss Collins to leave the property yesterday, you breached the trust. What? The trust immediately suspended your occupancy rights, pending trustee review. Richard slammed both hands on the table. She can't do this after she's dead. No, Mr. Foster replied evenly. She already did. Evelyn stepped backward. You promised this house belonged to us. Richard looked at her desperately. I thought it did. You thought. Her eyes filled with disbelief. I moved my children into this house because you guaranteed our future. I didn't know. You never checked. Jason and his sister exchanged frightened glances. The confidence they had shown the day before disappeared completely. They suddenly looked like children caught inside an adult disaster they never understood. Around the table, relatives began speaking all at once. I can't believe this. He planned everything. Margaret knew. So that's why she met with lawyers. Richard tried to interrupt, but no one was listening anymore. The authority he had relied on for years had vanished. Mr. Foster quietly closed one folder and reached into his briefcase one final time. There is one remaining instruction. He removed a sealed envelope addressed in Margaret's handwriting. Across the front were the words, to be opened only after Richard learns the truth. Without another word, the trustee slid the letter across the table toward Celine. Every eye in the room followed it. No one breathed. No one reached for the envelope. For several long seconds, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock Margaret had insisted on winding every Sunday. Daniel Foster gently pushed the letter closer to Celine. Your mother left specific instructions, he said quietly. She wanted you to read this aloud if Richard refused. Celine looked down at her mother's familiar handwriting. Her fingers trembled as she carefully broke the seal. Inside was a neatly folded letter. She took a slow breath. Then she began to read. If you are hearing these words, then the future I feared has already arrived. The room became perfectly still. Richard, I discovered your affair nearly a year before my death. I did not learn it through rumors. I saw the messages myself after you left your phone at the hospital one afternoon. Richard closed his eyes. He didn't deny it. At first, I wanted to confront you. Instead, I chose to spend whatever time I had left protecting the only person who never abandoned me, our daughter. Celine felt tears gathering, but she kept reading. While you were building another life, Celine was driving me to treatments, sleeping beside my hospital bed, managing my medications, and pretending not to be afraid so I could stay strong. Several relatives quietly lowered their heads. She never once asked what she would receive in return. Celine paused to steady her voice before continuing. Because this home was purchased jointly, and because Celine contributed financially to its renovations and upkeep for many years, I consulted attorneys and financial advisors. Daniel Foster nodded slightly as she continued. I transferred my ownership interest into an irrevocable family trust. Richard stared at the floor. Richard, you were never intended to lose your dignity. You were only expected to honor your family. If you chose compassion, the trust allowed you to remain here under limited occupancy rights. Celine turned the page. But if you attempted to remove our daughter from the home, replace our family immediately after my passing, or interfere with the trust, those rights would end automatically. A heavy silence settled over the room. Everything Daniel Foster had explained was written plainly in Margaret's own words. She had anticipated exactly what Richard would do. The final paragraphs were addressed only to Celine. My beautiful daughter. Celine's voice cracked. You spent years believing kindness meant accepting less than you deserved. It does not. You gave me every precious day I had left. You sacrificed promotions, vacations, friendships, and sleep, so I would never face illness alone. No mother could ask for a greater gift. Tears rolled freely down Celine's face. This house is not my greatest gift to you. My greatest gift is making certain that no one can erase the life we built together. Live here only if it brings you peace. If it does not, create a new beginning. But never allow guilt to keep you where love no longer exists. Celine lowered the letter. There wasn't a dry eye among Margaret's siblings. Even relatives who had believed Richard earlier looked ashamed. Aunt Helen quietly crossed the room and embraced Celine. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We should have trusted you." One by one, other family members followed. No one offered excuses. Only apologies. Richard remained seated. His shoulders, once squared with certainty, had collapsed. He looked toward Celine. "I never thought." She met his eyes for the first time since the funeral. "No." Her voice remained calm. "You never did." He opened his mouth to apologize, but no words came. There was nothing left to defend. Nothing left to explain. Daniel Foster stood. "As trustee, I am now required to enforce Margaret Collins' instructions." He placed a formal notice on the table. "Mr. Collins, your occupancy rights were terminated yesterday when you attempted to remove the primary beneficiary from the residence." Richard stared blankly at the document. "You are required to vacate the property in accordance with the trust's terms." Evelyn slowly stepped away from him. "You told me everything was settled." "I believed." She shook her head. "No. You assumed." Her voice wasn't angry anymore. It was disappointed. "I brought my children here because I trusted you." Without another word, she gathered Jason and his sister. "We're leaving." Richard reached toward her. "Evelyn." She didn't turn around. The front door closed behind them. For the second time in 2 days, Richard found himself standing alone. His legal challenge never gained traction. Every transfer had been properly documented months before Margaret's death. Independent witnesses had signed every document. Medical evaluations confirmed Margaret had been fully competent when making her decisions. The court upheld the trust exactly as written. Within weeks, Richard moved into a small apartment across town. Family gatherings became noticeably quieter. Some relatives kept their distance. Others stopped inviting him altogether. Not because Margaret had asked them to. Because they couldn't forget how quickly he had tried to erase her. Celine returned to the house slowly. She didn't rush to change anything. Instead, she restored what had been taken. Margaret's wedding photograph returned to the mantel. Her favorite reading chair went back beside the window. The lavender candles she loved filled the home once again. Months later, after the legal matters were finally behind her, Celine established a scholarship in Margaret's name for family caregivers, people who quietly put their own lives on hold to care for loved ones, just as she had. The house no longer felt like a place of betrayal. It became a place of remembrance. A place where kindness was protected instead of exploited. One autumn evening, after planting her mother's favorite flowers beneath the front window, Celine locked the front door. She looked at Margaret's smiling photograph in the hallway. A gentle smile spread across her face. "You made sure I was never alone."